clouds and long grasses, two very troublesome subjects that I'm going to look at in the one drawing. So a fair bit of value for you in this New South Wales country church scene, with a lot of long grasses in the foreground that are a really important part, I think, of the composition, but also these dramatic billowing summer's clouds in the background behind the spire. Also, I felt an important part of this scene. So how do we capture the grasses and the clouds without them just looking strange or too much of an emphasis or simply cartoon-like? Well, first we need to draw the whole scene. And for this, it's a very good example of how I start my drawings. I start with the place that makes the most sense to start. It's sometimes the very front, sometimes it's the very top, and sometimes it's one side. But most of the time it tends to be around the center, and particularly if there's architectural detail. But in this case, the architectural detail is overlapped, particularly in the lower half, with the grasses and some other foliage. So I have to be really careful, really mentally prepared and observant to know where to stop, so that I don't start to draw building where I need to draw plant matter closer. At this point I'm using a 0.1 Unipen millimeter, 0.1 millimeter fine liner. I also use a 0.2 for the grasses in the front, and I use a 0.05 for the clouds and for some of the shadow hatching. So I'm swapping between these three pens, but generally though, for those three different areas. I'm holding the pen back nice and far because I want some nice brisk lines. I want fairly rapid movement. Now, not this rapid. This drawing took me just over an hour to do. So you're actually watching most of the drawing at 3 times my normal drawings, my actual real-time drawing speed. When I do the grasses, I've sped that up to double time because there is simply a lot of repetitive line work. And the really important thing, I think, for understanding, for appreciating my technique of drawing long grasses is the big picture one. But I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to that. But at this point, you're watching it at 3 times my actual drawing speed. And so if you want to see it slower, you can use that cog icon, the YouTube settings icon that's somewhere on your screen, and you can reduce this speed to half speed. So that will get it almost to actual drawing time. And I do suggest at times that you do that just for a part of the video to get a closer, a more accurate feel of just what my actual drawing rhythm is. What we miss when we speed this up is the time such as this, where I'm looking at the drawing, the photo, I'm considering my pen, or even changing my pen. So it is good to be reminded of those things as well. So I'm progressing this church as I do any freehand architectural drawing. I have a zillion videos on that, how I do that. But basically find the easiest place to start with fairly straightforward shapes and start there, and then use that as a reference. And now you'll see what I also usually do with trees around my architecture, and that is I do some sort of dotted outline to help me work out where my marks will end, and also to get a sense of, is this actually where I want them to be? And if some of those marks I don't end up using are still there, they're small enough to usually not be very important in the final scene. So doing this bit of shadow here, sometimes it's a bit hard to know when to do this sort of detail, but I decided that because this was a fairly dark area, it might be good to establish that so I could help judge the value, the darknesses, when I do the trees behind particularly. So now I do some hatching, some cross hatching for the shade on this side of the church tower. Remember, shade is lighter than shadow. And now I have the shade on one side of the spire, well, on 2 sides, on this and the side to the left. What a shame that spire is just leaning slightly to the right. I don't know if you saw it, but it was the first thing I saw after I'd drawn it. But it's good not to be precious about these things. I already have a photo. If I wanted another photo, I just would have copied it twice, wouldn't I? I wouldn't have tried to draw it. So now I'm trying to capture the effect of these trees, which is largely value, light and dark. I'm not trying to draw leaves, but I am being very careful with the silhouette edge not to do just a heavy continuous outline, which I don't feel captures the feel, the effect visually of what we see at all well. Now you'll notice though, even though there's quite strong lights and darks, I'm doing at least light hatching over all of this foliage because it is dark against the clouds, against the sky, even though it's a lightish green and a darker green. So overall, all of it is still quite a lot darker than lots of the rest of this scene. So I want to show that by hatching all of it lightly. But I'm particularly careful with the values of an object when it comes up against another object. What I don't want is to have two similar values. And that often means I end up darkening one than the other more than in the reference to create greater contrast, which as well as providing just simply clarity between the two different objects, it often just feels more dramatic. Because this is a hot summer's day, the shadows are quite strong, quite dark, and I want to capture that as well. Because I am going to draw the clouds, and so that means that will make the sky actually feel a little bit overcast. So I want the shadows to fight against that and the strong contrast between the shadows and the bare brick that is in the sun, which I'm not doing any marks for at all for the brickwork because I want to keep it looking really, really bright. So now we're actually doing 4 times while I've switched to my 0.2 and I start the grasses. Now, the key thing about the grasses is not to draw the grass. It may look as though I'm doing that, but it's really coincidence. What I'm really doing is I'm hatching to create the darker bands of value that we have here. Now we have a dark band. There's actually a very strong contrast between the top of this dark band and the grass that's further back in the sunlight. And so I want to have that contrast between very dark and almost white. But then within the dark section, there are varieties, various shades of dark. And so I want to capture that too, because what I want overall is a sense of this foreground being dark, being in shadow. And that strip behind where we have that lovely transition from, we see the silhouette in darkness of the grasses on the left side to the silhouette of grasses in sunlight on the right-hand side. And that's the sort of thing we want to spot, we want to be able to do. Now, what you're seeing me do just now, this is my only regret besides that slightly leaning spire. The hatching I did for this tall, thin pine, I did horizontally. I thought about it for a while, and I think, well, yeah, that reflects the angle of the wall behind in many ways, but I really wasn't happy with it. I should have gone, I think, a diagonal that was fairly vertical, but not quite vertical. Much like what I did on the left-hand side of the towel. What do you think? Do you think it makes a difference? I actually later put that over the top of this, and I'm not sure that it really helped things. I don't think it made things worse, but I don't think it helped. Love to hear your thoughts on that. But that's fine, because I've now learnt something to take to my next drawing where I have this sort of event happening with shadows, and I know I'll certainly get to use what I've learnt here. So as I said, it may look as though I'm trying to draw the grass. I'm really trying to draw the bands of lights and darks, but because the edges of the bands and lights and darks are basically lines, then it still feels like I'm drawing the grass, but I'm actually trying to capture the values, the lights and darks, the same way I have for the tree that we see in the background on the left. I haven't tried to draw the leaves, I've tried to draw the lights and darks and capture something of the edges of those lights and darks. That's what I'm doing for the grass in the front. Although you'll see I did do some little dotted bits to indicate little seedy head things, and probably went a bit far with the little dots. But anyway, it's all fun. So now I have a tall thing, I mean, I think it's actually bamboo, growing in front of the spire, much closer to us, with the shadow behind. So that creates a negative spacing effect that I have to try and work out somehow. Now, with this grass, I keep pausing, and this is something that you don't really get to appreciate when you see it so sped up. But I keep pausing and just standing up and looking at it, thinking, well, how's it looking? Am I keeping the variation? Am I getting the slopes and whatnot? Because it is easy to just keep going without, for this sort of thing, for the grass, without looking back at the reference over and over, and basically making everything the same. And then we lose the variation that we're meant to be trying to have to create the effect of what we're looking at. So I do this tree on the right hand side. This is fairly dark in value. It's probably, in fact, the darkest value in the whole scene in the photo. Oh my goodness, I just realized there's something I missed out. I missed out the shadow on the roof on the right hand side. But because we can't actually see the tree that's cast in the shadow, it's not going to matter. So there you go. And after my experience with the other shadow for one of those trees, I think I'm glad I didn't see it. And again, I'm trying to do a little bit of hatching for all of this long, thin pine. I keep wanting to call it a cypress pine, but I don't think it is that. I think they're not long and skinny. Maybe it's a type of cypress pine. But I put even just light hatching to create a light value effect to make it a bit darker than the roof and the sky behind. So I spend a fair bit of work now on the grass. I'm really trying to establish some darker areas, but I kept going with doing darker areas really right up until the very end. Please hit the like button if you're finding this helpful. Don't forget the clouds are coming. Send in the clouds, as they say. So now I'm looking at lights and darks. And I'm thinking, where are the darks not dark enough? Are any of my darks too much the same over a large area? Now I can't make them lighter, but I can make them darker in certain areas to create a little more interest, a little more variety. So there is that possibility. So I'm using my 0.2 again, but now I've switched to my 0.5 because it is time for the clouds. Now, the clouds are the sort of thing I think we're a lot better drawing them at the end of our cloud drawing than we are at the start. But what I'm trying to do, firstly, is to just, whatever I draw it with a very light touch. Clouds are light and fluffy, and visually we can sense that, we can see that. So I'm trying to, and black ink is not a sympathetic medium to try and capture that lightness, that fluffiness, that subtlety. And in life, it's the difference between the warm greys and the cool greys that also adds meaning and interest. But at this point, I'm trying to keep it light, and I'm not trying to draw all the detail that we have here. I've made a decision that would make it just too complex. That would make it too detailed in what we see. And so I decided I would simplify things so that it would sit further back. Too much detail would also conflict it, I think, visually with the detail in the rest of the scene. Now, I looked at this and thought about it, and besides simplifying it somewhat, I also decided that I was going to introduce a fairly strong horizontal line emphasis, such as what I'm doing now, towards the base of the clouds, where we're sort of looking up at the bottom of them, and try and get some contrast between these flat lines, these horizontal lines, and the more curving, rounded parts where the cumulus cloud is starting to billow upwards, possibly getting ready for an afternoon thunderstorm, which is a very common event in New South Wales. I'm also holding this pen incredibly flat at an angle and as lightly as I can, so lightly that sometimes I move it back and forth and nothing comes out. The ink can't actually reach the paper, or not at the speed I'm dragging it across the paper. So I'm working very hard to keep this very light, because what I'm going to do is, in parts, I'm going to make it a bit darker by layering more hatching on top, but just in a few selected spots, particularly with that horizontal line work. Because I've also decided I want however many lines, however many marks I use for these clouds, I want slightly more heaviness on the upper left, just to kind of, I think, sort of balance and flow down with the other values. So working hard on that. Please hit the like button for me. Keeping things simpler. I think when I did the left-hand side, I'd found my not just rhythm, but my sense of what I was doing and how I was doing it, and became more at ease. So now I'm working at strengthening the values, darkening the values in some parts. Please hit that like button for me if you haven't already, if you've got to this far. What I decided not to do here was to do any lines for the darkness of the sky, because in fact, certainly in Australian summer, in the top part of our view, the sky is an incredibly deep and value-wise quite dark colour. So I'm thinking I might like to do a video where I do some line work for the actual sky colour rather than for the clouds. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your comments on this. Are you going to have a go? Of course, you'll find this reference posted on my channel community page if you'd like to. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. I had a lot of fun drawing this. I've put it aside for a while and thought, no, I'm going to do that one today, and I'm really glad I did. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this as well. Why not have a go drawing it? But whatever you do, and however it turns out, and whether you're happy with every bit or there are some parts you wish you'd done differently, make sure you have fun. I certainly did. I'll see you next time. Bye.